Today I have the honor to interview renowned filmmaker here present, João, also founder and director of Jaguar Films in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. How and when did you become fascinated with the subject of the Anunnaki? Who are they and where do they come from?
I became fascinated with the subject of the Anunnaki as a small boy, actually. I was probably somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, and Zecharia Sitchin came out with his first book at around that time. Yes. And I happened across it in a bookstore, and I was hooked from then on. As a small child, I had a lot of the same questions that he did regarding the biblical phrasings that seemed to be a little contradictory. So a lot of those same questions, I guess, were going on through my mind at the same time. And over the years, as I read more and more and took what his book, I guess, was the seed that was planted, and from there I went and explored more and more resources. I actually dug up some of the original resources or many of the original resources that he quotes in his books, and read them for myself from front to back, and made sure that I understood the things that he was quoting, and arriving at my own conclusions to the things that he was arriving to his conclusions. The more I learned, the more knowledge I gained, the more questions I had, and that sort of came into a lifelong interest in learning about the Anunnaki, learning about these ancient texts, learning about everything from astronomy to physics, and it incorporates everything there and in between.
What does, in your understanding, the word Anunnaki mean?
It's been translated many times from what I understand, and I'm no archaeologist or Sumerian text interpreter. The way that I've understood it to be interpreted is those from heaven to earth who came, which I think is it sounds to be the root prefix, the word an meaning heaven, ki meaning earth. So it sounds like it should be about right there in the middle.
What do you think is the connection between the word Anunnaki and the feeling the Bible speaks about? Well,
you know, that actually was probably one of my first, one of the instigators of my first interest was the apparent contradiction between the whole concept of Judeo-Christian religions having a monotheism, one singular God, and what's actually written in the Bible. And actually we use that as sort of the opener for the movie. It's one of the first lines in Genesis that reads, and God said, let us create man in our image. And it uses the word very specifically plural in both contexts. And at first I thought it was a mistake. I said, the text I'm reading has to be wrong, that can't be right. And then I proceeded to open everything from Christian Bibles to King James versions to Hebrew Bibles, and they all say the same thing. Yes. So it's a contradiction that got me started looking at things from and actually starting to explore where the original biblical stories came from, and then going into and exploring those stories. The Noah story, going back and looking at the Atrahasis epic, and then back even further to the Pishtim and the Ziusudra epic, and seeing where the roots of those stories came from, and it's both cleared up a lot of where those stories came from, and it clears up many of the contradictions, and then it also throws into the mix some pretty strange and outlandish things that most people would consider strange and outlandish from a modern day religious standpoint.
Your plan is to create a trilogy about the Anunnaki, and we have to go into who were they, where did they come from,
right,
and what were they doing here. Who are the Anunnaki? Where are they from?
Well, let's start with the first part of that, which is actually kind of interesting. Over the years, as I think I'd mentioned to you earlier, that I started a news group many years ago, which was basically an open forum for people to discuss their knowledge of pretty much everything having to do with the Anunnaki. I found that there's so many holes still left in what we know about Sumerian stories that getting additional input from additional places was very important to me, because people hold little bits of knowledge, little bits of truths in family stories and ancient religious things that they might have heard from different religions and different parts of the world, that I thought that that was a very important thing for me to dive into, and not just listen to one author or one source. So that was a very important thing. The second part was that it's a very controversial issue. To modern day religions, it's a very, now there are some religions that it may not be as shocking to others, but the idea that the modern biblical version that most people are used to is derived from sources that most people would say, if reading the sources, that they completely contradict what they're used to reading, it's a very touchy subject with a lot of people. So, and at the same time, the biggest selling book of all time is the Bible.
Yes.
The greatest selling book. So now my train of thought went like this: if the Bible is the best-selling book of all time, and the Bible is written upon stories that the majority of people on the planet don't know anything about, that would sort of make these stories even the best book of all written time. So knowing that I was going to get a lot of resistance and a lot of outcry for the topic to begin with, rather than taking it from a sensationalist standpoint and beating people over the head with the alien theory, I said, let me introduce the stories as best I can, as accurately as I can to what we see, without interjecting my viewpoint on them, but more or less introduce them to the stories, the characters of the stories, and try to keep them as accurate as possible. And we can throw in a little fiction here and there to make the story interesting, because people don't want a history lesson, and this wasn't meant to be a documentary. It was meant to be an entertainment factor too. But while we're entertaining and while we're making it a science fiction, we're also very gently introducing them to all of the actual characters in the Sumerian pantheon and the Sumerian stories and legends, and they're getting an actual history lesson from the Sumerian viewpoint at the same time. And the reason we broke it into 3 movies was for that reason. The first movie is a modern day story, and the modern day story is a fiction, and it was taken from the standpoint that of all the Sumerian stories, they all talk about, there's a lot of texts that talk about the arrival, there's a lot of texts that talk about while the Anunnaki were here, and there's few that talk about their departure, but not in enough to where I felt that it was really summed up that they all just left one day. So the first movie is actually the second in the trilogy, which is a modern day tale, and basically addresses the Anunnaki story from the point of the flood, the deluge, up until today. Okay. Basically. The second movie in the trilogy, I felt that after people were introduced and interested enough to do what our actors who worked on the movie, who didn't know much about the topic when we first started, everybody who comes into context and is gently introduced to it becomes enamored with the topic and wants to learn more and more and more. So my feeling was, rather than beat people over the head with it, gently introduce them to a very interesting story, let them absorb it gently without putting any kind of threat to their personal beliefs in it. And then once they absorb the story, then when we introduce the second story is a tale of the entire story of the Anunnaki from the beginning of their existence to the beginning of our existence up until the flood. So it addresses their prehistory up until the flood. And the interesting thing and the nice thing about it will be they will already be in tune with a lot of the characters, because they'll know them all from the first movie, and they'll know sort of some of the backstory. And then the third movie takes place from current day, and it's sort of a projection into the future with an interesting twist.
Is it already known when this movie maybe will be released?
We're hoping, again, this is a completely independent film, and we did this for a number of reasons. Number one, for complete creative control. Number two, we're a special effects company, so we sort of had the wherewithal to try to set a new standard for small independent films to do some things that haven't been done by a small independent film before. That's the positive side. The flip side of that coin is that because we're a small independent production, we don't have hundreds of people working around the clock on this film, so it takes us a little bit longer to get it done than most films, especially accomplishing as much as we're trying to accomplish. We're hoping that we'll be releasing it by the end of the year.
The end of the year.
Yeah.
And then you will start the next year on Annunaki number 2.
Right, which will be titled Annunaki 2.
You stated that Annunaki number 2 will cause a tidal wave. What makes you think it will do that?
Well, the hopes is, and again, I don't approach it from being sensationalist. I'm not really, I don't like to go down that alley. It's not my personality. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not a sensationalist kind of a person. And I think it's sort of a hackneyed and cliche thing to do at this point. I mean, everybody's got the new thing that causes the big emotional uprising in people. I don't even have to name names. Everybody knows can name off the top of their head a list of films that are the newest outrage, I think. And my object was not to approach it from there, and that's exactly why I did this first one as a gentle introduction to the topic. My hopes is that people will truly become interested in the topic, because this is not made up. I mean, although the story is a fiction, these are texts that we've found and have been deciphered and are as credible as the biblical versions that we know. They may not be as well known, and they may not be as adopted as the biblical versions, but truly it's been found that many of the stories that we read in the Bible are actually based on these earlier stories. So if you believe in the Bible, which many people do, the majority of people do, it sort of stands to reason that they would then at least not be offended enough to take a look at these stories. Where the tidal wave comes in, though, is that these stories are vastly different than the biblical ones, and they've been censored and edited in the versions that you read in the Bible so dramatically. And I'll give you an example. This is an interesting. You talked about technology and such, and this is something that we came about in doing a science fiction. We try to keep as accurately to the ancient Sumerian inscribings and carvings and artwork that we could find when we did the designs for the ships in this. And truly, the Sumerian versions of the text call them flying machines to some degree. They had names for them. In Mesopotamia, there's carvings, and the Assyrian carvings of the gods, they actually show them riding in these flying machines. They have names for them, landing sites for them. So what we did is we took the original carvings and we created a reverse engineered them, if you will, to create a working ship. And what we found out was actually extremely interesting. While going through this with some scientists who are in the aeronautical field, we said, well, this is sort of a plausible design, but you know, this wouldn't be very efficient for flying under circumstances. It would be great for flying low altitudes with the wings spread. And then I came up with the idea, well, what if we folded the wings in for other type of takeoff? I had gone through some Indian Hindu texts and descriptions of other types of ships from ancient texts. And what we found was, what we were left with when the wings came in is the stereotypical UFO. The stereotypical UFO design is what you're left with. Which then again, of course, led us into trying to reverse engineer some of that. Is it a vertical takeoff? Is it what's the means of propulsion? And we started doing a lot of these designs, and we found that the results we had were very interesting.
If we look at the big success of the book The Da Vinci Code, which also became a wonderful movie, this is a kind of a development which you can compare, let's say, the production of the trilogy 1 Annunaki, 2, 3, maybe with the development of books coming out like the Da Vinci Code. What do you think about that?
Well, the Da Vinci Code, it's interesting because that Da Vinci Code caused such an uprising. It caused a big stir in what that was about. And if you look at the time scale of Anunnaki story and Da Vinci Code, the Da Vinci Code is actually only a small portion after what would be Anunnaki 1, this first one Anunnaki, the first movie. It would really be from the time that the next movie, Anunnaki 2, ends, which is after the flood. There's a small portion in there which is where we transition from BC to AD, basically. And the Da Vinci Code, that whole story, encompasses from that up into our semi-modern day civilization. It leaves the whole backstory behind it wide open. There's thousands and thousands of years of history behind there that doesn't even touch. So in the scope of things, it's a very controversial issue, the Da Vinci Code. But when you look at the scope of what we're actually talking about, and the scope of time, and the scope of humanity's beliefs in a belief system, I think this story is much bigger.
You know how, let's say, the Christian churches, and especially the Catholic Church, reacted to the Da Vinci Code. Do you have any idea how they could react to one Anunnaki, two Anunnaki, and so on?
Well, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know what their reaction's going to be. We've already been banned in the Philippines, for what I understand. We haven't even released the movie yet. There was somebody who mentioned on one of the boards that once the movie's made, we're not allowed there. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it sort of sets the tone for the way it's going to be. There's a lot of controversy on the subject. I think that there's definitely going to be we're definitely going to have our share of outcry for the topic in general. There's an old saying that when people don't understand something, their tendency is to say no.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm sure we will get that. But anybody who takes the time to actually look into what we're saying and look into what we're quoting, we're actually not even taking a position ourselves on what is. We're just trying to retell a story that's been, if not completely squelched, pushed under the carpet so that it's not made known. I mean, for a story that the entire Bible is based upon, or the majority of the Bible is based upon, the well-known parts of the Bible are based upon, to not be known by the majority of people is kind of an interesting phenomenon right there.
7 years ago, in the year 2000, Zachariah Sitchin, he went to Rome, and he talked there with Corrado Balducci. Maybe you know about him.
I've heard about that.
Yes. You know, Corrado Balducci, he says, of course the universe, there are many civilizations all over the place.
What was interesting about, I don't know if it was that conversation or a conversation that followed with the Catholic Church, was that, from what I understand, the Catholic Church had made a statement in that realm of time saying that for there to be other life on other planets would not be inconsistent with the religious precepts of the religion. And that brings us to sort of another point why, to me personally, I don't really understand what the big outrage would be. Although I do understand it's almost a definite thing. The ancient stories of the Anunnaki talk about the Anunnaki talking within themselves about there being a greater creator, which brings up another interesting point. When I first started the script for this movie, and when I first started doing some initial testing of what people's thoughts were, there was this big swell of people who seemed to pit creationalism against evolutionary starts. And what we found was, as I got farther and farther in the book, that the two fit together almost perfectly. There's no reason why there can't be creationalism and evolution, and in fact, they support each other. They support that they're both right. So what we sort of became our coined term with the movie is that creationalism and evolutionism is you're both right and you're both wrong. It became sort of the coined term. everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
The Anunnaki created us in their image. So what's your opinion about this?
Well, you know, that's another really, that was one of my most fascinating topics, and from the research and the studying I've done on the topic, it's more than just a simple question. It's more than just a simple question of did they create us. It's a question of the nature of celestial creation also. According to Sitchin and some other scientists, there's some phenomenon in our immediate galaxy that don't make a lot of sense. The moon and the Earth being next to each other are one of those things that don't make a lot of sense. The composition's not right. The size of the moon compared to the Earth is not right. So there, I think it's pretty well determined that there was some sort of collision that happened on Earth at some point in history that cut away a piece of the Earth and caused the continents to do this shifting to fill the gap, or to replace the gap that was left. And I think that they even believe that somewhere in the Pacific Ocean is the point of impact where that gap would have taken place because of the depth and whatnot. That collision could very well have taken place with a planet that the Anunnaki eventually developed on, that they came to be on. So if that be the case, we're really the same particulate matter, the same DNA, the same molecules of creation. We're probably on both planets at the same time, meaning that we could have developed from a similar chain, from a similar construct, but they developed this way and we developed that way. Similar to an animal that develops, you take two animals that are the same species and put them in two different places, they will eventually evolve into different species. They may have evolved ahead of us and we were behind, and they did a little genetic upgrade to bring us up to speed with them. But I don't think it's that far-fetched to believe that they created us, creationalism in some manner, that a God created us, but yet evolutionary, that we were actually came to be anyway, that we were evolving up to that point to begin with. So that's kind of what I was talking about, you know, evolutionary theory and creational theory sort of working together, not against each other.
Erik van Däniken, and he said in, I think it was his first book, were the gods astronauts, right? I think that was the title. Now one of his latest books is The Gods Were Astronauts. So now Sitchin says the fact that we have been created by aliens, that does not mean that there is no divine power in the universe.
Absolutely, and in fact what I said before was exactly that, was that there were texts that show the Anunnaki talking about not feeling good about playing, in quotations, playing God. They had their own feelings about not tampering with God's work, let's call it. So I think they had some sort of higher being type of thought process going on there too.
The god Anu, I think he was the father of Enki and Enlil, the two gods who came to this planet to colonize this planet here.
Right.
He was not in favor of being created a being as a Lulu Amelu, which means primitive worker.
Right.
I think he was against it, right?
There was many of them that were against it, and if you, and again, these things may sound outlandish to people listening, but if you would take them and put them into a construct that we can identify with, let's say we take a primitive chimpanzee or orangutan, and now we splice our DNA with it and get this hybrid primate, I think a lot of people would have a problem with that, which is already apparent in the cloning issue that's going on around the world. And then if you would start drawing a parallel where they created mankind and then started forming relationships and families and procreating with these beings they created, once people started forming relationships and procreating with these hybrid chimpanzee or orangutan primates, I think you'd have a lot of people throwing their arms up and having a temper tantrum with that too. So you can definitely see the parallels and why it doesn't sound that far-fetched when you draw those kind of parallels.
Alvin Toffler, do you know about him? He wrote a book in the 70s, Future Shock. And he said that we will go into a period of time that there will be many, many new developments, and because of this, many people not being able to cope with all those new developments and being shocked by all this new information coming up. And how do you see that?
It's shocking, you know, to know that. I would be lying if I said that once I started digging into all this, that my whole perception of what many people's lives are based on has changed dramatically over the years. When you see the original scripts and the original transcripts of what these stories that people are believing in were based upon, and it doesn't change necessarily your morals, it just changes your outlook on the rituals that have been created, which we call religion, and really, I would say the rituals of it are the thing that become change for people, and would be maybe changed by it, because and that's not to say that tradition isn't good. I think that tradition is a good thing. Tradition, the difference between tradition and ritual, in my mind, is that ritual is based on something you feel you have to do. You have to do this because of what the Bible says, what this religion says, what that religion says. Tradition is something you do because it's part of your history, and you do because you enjoy doing it, and because it celebrates your history. So I think that there is a transition there for me personally between what I see people doing as ritual and as something that they feel they have to do, and then when you look at the original script, you say, well, you know what, everything they're believing, everything that they're looking at is based on something that's not the story that they're actually reading. It's based on something that says something totally different. So you know, if you tell somebody that a friend walked into a store, and in that store, the person at the counter picked up a gun and shot the person next to him, well, that sounds like a horrible event. If you leave out the portion where the person that came in was an escaped criminal who was also holding a gun, the whole concept of the story changes. Well, people are reading and believing in things that the story that was actually the derivation is completely different than what they're believing in. So, in a way, it's people have been sold somewhat of a false bill of goods.
Do you have a certain goal with those 3 movies?
The goal really is, again, and we sort of discussed this with some of the other things we were talking about earlier, which is, rather than a sensationalist clashing of ideas, which is what most people will immediately do, because when people don't understand, they say no. And rather than this clashing of ideas, the more you look into it, the more you research it, the more you start reading and figuring out both sides, you realize that it's not 2 clashing ideas, it's one idea with pieces left out on both sides. So you wind up with something where it really goes together in perfect harmony. It's not conflicting at all. The pieces fit together very nicely, and there's room for both. I guess that's my whole point, my whole statement, if there is one, is not to cause conflict. My whole point is that we're all right and we're all wrong. And once people see that, think of how many differences are immediately resolved. Think of how many conflicts in belief systems are resolved once everybody realizes that we're all telling the same story and not different stories with opposing viewpoints.
You were telling me the Lost Book of Enki, this story, you know, will also be somewhere woven into one of your movies, right?
It covers a lot of the same material, and we've talked to Mr. Sitchin and have had a correspondence with him about it, and it's something that in the future we have a story that's our own story for the second movie, which covers it strictly from the source material, meaning strictly from the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Ziusudra epic, the Gilgamesh epic. We've taken that from all of those Kramer's books and all the people who did the original Mesopotamian transliteration work. We've taken and made our own story from that. The thing I enjoyed about Sitchin's book was that he had this human side to it, and if that's a good word for it, but he had a human side to it, and a side that showed the Anunnaki's position. It showed from their standpoint what this was, and I thought that was a really it was a nice touch, and I really enjoyed that, and I thought that would be a great thing to add if it works out and if it comes to pass that happens.
So the latest book by Sichi, you mentioned that is The End of Day. Did this give you more information than you already had about the whole subject?
You know what? He's done an amazing life's work that's beyond my comprehension. The amount of information he's distilled and brought down and been able to put together is just astounding. A lot of the information is stuff that I've known. A lot of the information is stuff that he has correlated in the more recent years. That's extremely interesting. Whether it comes conclusively to an end, conclusively to any sort of end result, that's something that I guess only history will remain to be seen at the end. I found it very interesting, and one of the topics that interests me about the story and about our stories in particular is the worldwide and global nature of the story, and not just the isolated stories in Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamian area, the New World side of this, the South American ruins and remains, and the stories that split off and diverge in this wildly crazy tree of history from Egypt. It's just a simple observation is if you look at the step pyramids in ancient Mesopotamia, the step pyramids in South America, there's step pyramids in China, they all follow many of the same building design, they follow many of the same astronomical alignment design. It's kind of almost silly to think that there was not some sort of connection there between them.
So when you confront religious people, priests, reverends, with this knowledge, with this material, how do they react?
I've had many of these conversations with many different religious backgrounds, and I found to my curiosity that many of them will talk about it for a little while, up to a point.
Up to a point.
The minute you hit upon what I like to call the boundary lines, you hit upon the hard and fast contradictions that are written, they basically shut down on you and don't want to talk about it anymore. And they really, I've yet to run across some that will continue to discuss in an open-minded way what we're being presented with. Once we hit a certain point, they basically just shut down and don't want to talk about it, because now you're threatening the base of their principles, which to me, again, it's not really I'm not on the attack. I'm not trying to be controversial.
Communication.
It's to me it makes perfect sense, and it's not contradictory really in any way. It if anything, it supports their belief.
So sitting in front of me, who?
Steve Roth, playing the role of Marduk.
Marduk. And who is Marduk?
Marduk, that is a very, very interesting question. And when I was first told about this film, a fellow actor said, "Did you ever hear anything about the Anunnaki?" And I thought it was Oriental food. But then he began to explain a lot of the story, and I was fascinated because it's something that I've always had a void in my life. Ever since I was 12 years old, I always thought, there has to be more to our creation. I just believe there was so much more, and the investigation I did for this film brought that to light. And I'm very pleased and honored to play somebody of the magnitude of Marduk. Now
you are interested in the subject of the Anunnaki, and did this getting to know about this knowledge, change your life in some way?
Yes, it did. I mean, it's enhanced a lot more of the information that I never knew about, and now having to read about it and collaborating certain beliefs that I had has enriched me. It's hard to explain. I mean, it's something that I'm not one to visit churches. I shied away for many years because of the commercialism behind it. And I'm sorry to say, but that's how I feel. I feel a lot closer to the Creator just by sitting on a sunrise, for instance, or at the beach. The power of that magnitude that's out there is a lot closer to me in that fashion than going into a building or whatnot. But
what's your idea about the effect this movie, those three movies, will have on human society on this planet?
Well, being a very controversial theme, that John has written a magnificent story, it is going to enlighten people, some to a degree of even anger, because the human is a creature of habit by nature. You learn one set of rules and you say, that's fine, I can live with that, I'm fine with that. And when things come to where there may be more information that disrupts that normal trend, they don't take it good. We don't take it good. We like to know that everything is in its place. And this film is definitely something that's going to be very controversial, to give you more information about, well, what if? What if it wasn't the way it was written? Now, for instance, you give an example that the Vatican will feel this very controversial and will put their 2 cents in the way they did with the Da Vinci Code, because they have certain beliefs, and this is disrupting those beliefs. Now, I believe that we only know the story of Christ on 2,000 years ago, or whatever that was. But what happens before that? Hundreds of thousands of years ago, leading up to that event.
Yes.
So that is what's going to bring the people into a different mindset to say, well, okay, that's plausible, or it's not plausible, I don't want to hear about it.
If you would try to describe the character of Marduk, what is his role, what is his action in this movie? What is he doing?
Well, based upon what I've read, and obviously it was when I first got the script, it was magnificently well written. And I had to base myself on the words that were written, because I had no idea how to play a god of that magnitude. This is a person or a being that had tremendous beliefs, and people that back in that era believed that he was such a superior being. How do you play somebody like that? You feel small by description. So I used the words of what was described about him, and in my own investigation of the backstories that led up to how the Babylonians and the Sumerians thought of him. He was like the creator to the modern man today, like Jesus Christ would be for the modern religions today. So it was a very difficult role, quite honestly, and I had trouble at the beginning until I began to understand how a person like that, or an entity like that, would want to be portrayed as.